So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the first of our series of webinars on peatland restoration. I'm Lewis Wheeler, I work for Natural England, and I'm the technical officer for the LIFE Moor Space project. So, today's webinar is going to ease us in with an introduction to the LIFE-funded projects that we've been running on thorn and crole moors, starting with the That's Life project, which ran from 2014 to 2019, and the current LIFE Moor Space project, which started in 2021 and is due to end in 2026. So to introduce who we've got on the call today, we've got Paul Schofield, who is the LIFE Moor Space project manager working for Natural England. We've got Harriet Santon, who is the land management officer working on the LIFE Moor Space project from Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust. And we have Neil Pike, who was the That's Life project manager, also working for Natural England. So a bit of housekeeping. Video and mics will stay off during the call, and we have a Q&A function for anyone that's got any questions. These will be answered throughout the call, and any that need a bit more answer behind them we'll do at the Q&A session at the end. So with that, we'll kick off the That's Life Moor Space webinar, and we're going to start with one of the project videos that we've been producing, showing what we're doing as part of the LIFE Moor Space project.
There is no typical day, and that is part of the joy of working somewhere like this, I think. Thorn Hatfield Moors belong to the nation. They're managing the sites for people as well as for wildlife. So we'll be doing a lot of monitoring at that time of year, birds, butterflies, reptiles. The Moor Space project will also be developing further some innovative ways we've been managing and restoring peat bogs. The recipe, if you like, for restoring a peat bog is to try and keep the water table as close to the surface as possible for as much of the year as possible. Over hundreds and hundreds of years, we want to rebuild the domes of peat on Thorn and Hatfield moors, which were removed through peat extraction commercially. The risk of wildfires is an increasingly important issue as the climate changes. Off-road motorbikes, they can destroy birds' nests. Invasive species like rhododendron can come to dominate even on really quite wet peat bog. We could be losing in places up to a centimetre of peat a year.
But with EU LIFE funding, we're working on reversing this decline.
So that was the first of our project videos we're producing for this, the LIFE Moor Space project. And now I'll just give you a quick overview of the two sites. So we've got Thorn Moors, which is primarily owned by Natural England and is part of a larger Humberhead Peatlands area, which is a remnant wetland from thousands of years ago. So Thorn is a SSSI and an SAC for a degraded raised bog, still capable of natural regeneration, and it supports a whole host of species, including some rarities like the thorn pinpalp beetle, which is found nowhere else in the UK, as well as breeding nightjar, for which it's got an SPA designation. So the moors have been cut for peat throughout history for use as fuel or animal litter, and then later in horticulture. So initially it was cut by hand, and then through modernisation and mechanisation, the moors were mechanically cut, which left behind peatlands in desperate need of restoration. And the water levels across site have been made to be quite variable through the peat harvesting, which has prevented natural regeneration of peat. And then we've got crole moors, which the majority is owned by Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust. and thorn and crole are separated along the Yorkshire-Lincolnshire border by the Swinefleet drain, which is a drain that cuts between the two sites. Now, it is also a triple SI as part of the Thorn, Goole and Crole Moor triple SI. And unlike Thorn, Crole was never mechanically cut for peat. So the peat depths are up to 5 metres in some places and an average of 3 metres across the whole site, whereas Thorn is looking more at around an average of 1.5 metres across the site. Crole is also home to the Peatland Railway, which is a volunteer-run organisation operating on North Lincolnshire Council land on Crole Moor. And the organisation restores some of the Peatland locomotives that would have been used to transport peat off-site. Once they stopped using horses, they moved on to little trains, like the one in the image down to the bottom right of your screen. So that one's called Little Peat and was found on the moors, and they restored this with a local engineering college, and now that's up and running, and they do little train rides along the moors in Little Peat, which is really cool. It's an important history of why the moors are like what they are. So I'm going to hand over to Neil now to talk us through the That's Life project.
Can you continue to scroll through the slides for me, Lewis, as we go?
Yes, sure.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, everybody. Well, so my name is Neil Pike. I am currently the Senior Officer in Natural England's National Operations Team, covering habitat and species management support for our 133 national nature reserves, of which Humberhead obviously is one. But in 2019 to 2020, I took over from the previous project manager to bring the Humberhead That's Life Plus project to a close. So this is really a very brief overview of the aims of that project, and also I think a little bit of a recognition of some of the strengths and weaknesses of the project, and some of the things it was able to deliver and some of the things that it wasn't. We have the next slide, please, Lewis. So I think it's worth giving a little bit of background in the immediate years prior to the first Life project taking place. It's worth saying that even as the peat was being industrially removed, so when the industrial scale peat removal was taking place on Thorn, there was both a real interest and a campaigning interest, all revolving around the ecology of the moors, and that goes back decades. In fact, it goes back longer than that, because there's biological recording that took place across Thorn and Hatfield moors back into the previous century. So this was well known as an area of high biodiversity value, even as it was being cut. Obviously, as we got towards the end of the 20th century, and the value and importance of lowland raised bogs, not just in terms of their biodiversity, but also relating to their impact and the influence they can have on climate change, as that was being better understood, the UK government became more interested in and more involved in the protection of existing and the restoration of degraded moors. And in fact, the UK government bought out the remaining peat extraction rights on Thorn and Hatfield moors in 2001. Some peat extraction continued after that on licence, but all peat extraction had ceased by 2004, and the entire area was handed over then, with the exception of Crole, which had been bought by the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust earlier, to English Nature, as it was then, for the management of the site, and with the intention of restoring the lowland raised bog. Obviously, in 2007, English Nature became Natural England as part of the NERC Act, and immediately following that, we had the 2009 financial crisis, and that had a significant impact on Natural England budgets, as it did across the whole of government. And those impacts included significant reductions in the budget that we had to do our nature reserve management. Throughout this period, I think it's important to note that the character of the site was changing. Now, this had both positive and negative impacts. And one of the things that we discovered as part of the LIFE project is that peats and peatland sites are dynamic and respond positively and negatively quickly to environmental change. So it's quite important to recognise that even in the 10 years between peat extraction ceasing across the site and the first LIFE project starting, the site was changing significantly, both as a result of environmental change, but also as a result of management. Can we have the next slide? Thank you. So a few details about the first LIFE project. It ran from July 2014 to July 2019. It had an eligible budget of just under €5.5 million, and the EU funded just under half of the eligible costs. Most of the match funding came from the UK government, either via Natural England or via the Environment Agency. And the original project was due to complete in 2017, but was extended for 24 months for a range of reasons. I think primarily because what the original project brief had laid out was probably far too ambitious for a 3-year project, and a 5-year project was a much more realistic delivery timetable. As it happens, we marginally overspent, so we ended up spending slightly more money than we had in the EU budget, but that was fine because obviously as we were coming out of the financial crunch at the tail end of the project, we actually managed to find some internal funding to support some of the project work that sort of sat alongside with, but that wasn't directly funded through the EU project. Thank you, Lewis. So I think it's worth saying that the project aims were kind of really threefold. The first was to improve water level management and improving control over water levels through more effective hydrological manipulation. The second was to remove scrub, some of which was rhododendron, which is referenced in the opening video. And also, something that we haven't mentioned yet is also the population of European nightjar that occurs on site. Nightjar is an interesting issue on Humberhead because the site is an SPA for its nightjar population. The nightjar population there is a relict, I think, of both the surrounding habitats around the peat bog on Thorn and Hatfield Moor, but it also represents the fact that there is some habitat on the site which is typical of degraded suboptimal bog that nightjars are using. So there is an issue with restoring the bog and the potential implications that might have on nightjar populations here. It was a tricky process to ensure that we were providing sufficient habitat outside the bog restoration area to ensure that our nightjar population that increased at the very minimum didn't decrease, so we were putting the SPA at risk. And of course, with all LIFE projects, there's a series of programs and events, technical conferences, education and engagement to underline the value and the importance of lowland raised bog in the England landscape. Thank you, Lewis. So we'll look at these very quickly in turn. Water level management, I think it's worth saying that any industrially managed peat site, the legacy water management that we were left when we took the site on was designed entirely to support peat extraction. So its main purpose was to get water off the site, to dry the top levels of peat out so that they could be milled on an industrial scale. One of the things that the first LIFE project aimed to do was to mitigate that and to change the way that the water level management system worked. So its primary purpose was to keep water on site or to manage water levels during high rainfall events or wet winters to ensure the water levels weren't so high that they were flooding out areas of bare peat. The project aimed to redesign the whole of the hydrological system on Thorn to better effectively manage water levels. And we did this in a number of ways. Partly it was about the traditional mechanisms for plastic piling, using peat dams, peat bunds and weirs. And also we put in a number of tilting weirs and larger water structures, including a very large pumping station on Thorn Moors, whose aim was primarily to remove water during periods of very wet winters or very high rainfall. Degraded peat reforests very quickly, so scrub was an issue on Thorn Moors in particular. And scrub removal for the site also included rhododendron control to prevent the spread of rhododendron. It was recognised that evapotranspiration was a contributor to suboptimal water levels. It did, in the highest areas with the largest and densest scrub populations, did reduce the water table, primarily because, again, it worked in cohort with a water level management system that was designed primarily to keep the bog dry. So it was important that we were able to work with both of those things in cohort to be able to get better water level management. And we removed over 600 hectares of scrub as part of the project. Nightjars, as I've mentioned earlier, were using parts of the degraded bog as breeding locations. Restored bog isn't really very suitable for breeding nightjars. They don't like to get their feet particularly wet, and they are ground nesting birds. So there was very much a case of trying to maintain and create habitat around the outside of the site or on areas of the site where sand overlaid peat, where nightjar territories could be maintained, or we could improve the quality of the habitat for breeding nightjar. We also did a project to radio track nightjars to establish how they used the site and where they went, because we didn't really know that. And also to establish whether or not our population was bucking the trend in terms of breeding as far as nightjars are concerned nationally. I think the general assumption is that nightjar populations are retreating south. The nightjar population at Humberhead is one of the larger populations of nightjar in northern England, so it was quite important to ensure that we weren't doing anything to reduce that overall population. And obviously, as with all of these things, there is quite a lot of survey and monitoring taking place to ensure that the progress that the site is making is in accordance with what the targets we've set out in the LIFE project. So we undertook a range of vegetation monitoring using Natural England's Common Standards monitoring procedure. We've got a range of infrastructure now in place to establish and understand the impacts of the work that we've done on water level management. That also helps us to recognise when we need to intervene to change water levels. And the invertebrate assemblies was also monitored. And this is particularly important because not just does Humberhead support a series of very rare and location-limited invertebrate species, but it also has a very long history of invertebrate recording and is recognised internationally as important for its invertebrate fauna. So understanding what impacts work might be having as a result of the project on invertebrate ecology was really important to us. And there was a range of technical engagements. Any of you who are familiar with the LIFE processes, that LIFE does place a very high value on engagement, public engagement, events to encourage and ensure that both the lessons learned from LIFE projects are shared, but also that the work that's being done on Natura sites is recognised and valued by both ecologists and scientists, but also the public who live around these sites. So we did a range of things focused on lesson learning, but also celebrating and sharing the value of the site with both our professional colleagues and with our local population. Obviously, the outcomes of the project are identified on the LIFE project website if you want to go and have a look at that in detail. Obviously, I'm not going to go through that in detail here, but basically, we were building on the work that other organisations had done and had been doing for a very long time. There are voluntary organisations, there are charitable organisations, natural history organisations that have been associated with Thorn and Crowell Moors for a long time. And we really were just working on the back of some of the campaigning that they had done previously. I think it's fair to say that the SAC, and obviously the LIFE project works on an SAC basis, is a complicated site. And it's complicated for a number of reasons, not just the infrastructure put in place by the industrial peat manufacturers, but also, it's essentially two sites. We haven't talked very much about Hatfield, which is the other half of the SAC, and the vast majority of the work done on the LIFE project was done on Thorn and Crowell, and there was very little activity on Hatfield. And I think the various state of restoration is represented by the differences in habitat quality on Thorn and Crowell as compared to Hatfield, which I think is less advanced in terms of its restoration. It has acted as a catalyst for further investment. We'll talk about the new LIFE project in a moment, but also we've got a new office and accommodation used for scientific purposes as a result largely of the investment that the LIFE project put into it. That actually was funded by DEFRA and the government. It didn't come out of the LIFE money, but it was generated, or the interest and the project was generated from the benefits that the LIFE project delivered. And I think it's fair to say that the first LIFE project that represents a step on the road towards restoration. We were never going to fully restore Thorn and Crowell Moors based on 5 years' work. But what we could do was put in place a lot of the stepping stones necessary, a lot of the infrastructure necessary, and a lot of the expertise within both Natural England and within the site team to help move restoration forward. However, and this is particularly the case with Hatfield, but it's also the case with Thorn and Crowell, there is still plenty of work to do, and this is really just the first stage. Thank you, Lewis.
Thank you, Neil. Yeah, that was a great run through for that's LIFE project. As Neil said, it's the first step towards restoring these sites, and that brings us on to the LIFE Moor Space project, which kicked off in 2021 and is due to run until the end of 2026. So the focus of the LIFE Moor Space project is on the Goulmoor area to the sort of northeast of Thorn Moors, and Crowell Moors, which is down to the sort of southeast section, and they're highlighted in red on that map down to the right of the screen. Now, the main aims for the LIFE Moor Space project are to restore the hydrology by tackling some more of the drainage issues that we have that Neil touched on, to look at revegetating some of the bare peat that we have on site, to deal with the endless sort of scrub and rhododendron issues, to look at fragmented ownership. We have budget to buy land, which we've successfully purchased one piece of land on the Goulmoor area and a little bit on Crowell Moor, but also to work in partnership with our surrounding landowners to create a functioning lag to protect the moors from any nutrients from the surrounding agriculture, and also to protect the surrounding agriculture from any hydrology work that we're doing on the bog. There's a lot of sort of strip farming, and landowners own strips into the SSSI, so working with local landowners is really, really important. Another piece is wildfire management. In the video I showed earlier, it showed some footage from the Hatfield wildfire in 2020. So this is obviously a big problem, and with climate change could become even worse. So we've cut some fire breaks on Goulmoor and have worked with local fire services to provide equipment and training for dealing with moorland fires. And then, as Neil mentioned, a big part of LIFE projects are the promotion of the value of raised bog habitats to a variety of audiences through webinars and workshops, etc. So that is the aims of our LIFE Moor Space project, and we'll just take a look at the next project video.
Peatlands are hydrological systems that need water to prevent the release of carbon emissions and support peat-building plants like sphagnum mosses. Using EU LIFE funding, the LIFE Moor Space project installed a series of dip wells on Thorn and Crowle Moor in 2023 to monitor water levels. Popping a dip well into a peatland requires geosock, a dip meter, some caps, a Bluetooth reader, Kevlar string, some dip well tubes and a data logger. And now we're off to site to get some results. The loggers collect heaps of data which is converted into groundwater level data. Our drone surveys mapped out areas that need more or less water, as well as bare peat patches that need revegetating with sphagnum mosses, so that we can prevent carbon loss and build up peat depths to actively lock away more carbon in our site. Our LIFE grant has enabled us to clear and block drains so we can get water to where it's needed, and when we've got too much, we pump it off-site. All of this work means that in 2024 and 2025 we can plant loads of sphagnum on the moors and maintain water levels efficiently whilst they establish. Once they have established, the mosses store loads of water, making it easier to manage water levels over long periods of time, and this protects the peatlands through hot, dry summers.
So I'm just going to touch on the hydrology, water management of what we're looking to do during the Moor Space project. So our aim is to keep water at ground level. We appreciate that we're probably not going to be able to do that through kind of the whole year. So we're targeting 20 centimetres either below or above ground level. Aim of this is to promote the kind of right conditions for the regrowth of our preferred vegetation. So sphagnum mosses and cotton grasses, they're the plants that'll cover the bare peat, and eventually they'll start to first of all they'll prevent bare peat from oxidizing, releasing carbon into the atmosphere. And then eventually they will turn into peat themselves and lock away carbon through a process called carbon sequestration. And so we really want those vegetations to grow. So we're probably being a little bit more targeted than the That Slice project. They did a really good job at re-wetting the moors and getting water where we needed it. But now we've got some areas that are too wet. We've also got some areas that are too dry, so we really need to target those while keeping the conditions right for the wider moors that are developing at their own speeds. So we are clearing ditches, as we mentioned in the video. That's to help get water off site when we really need to manage those water levels. Say we've got some kind of high rainfall events and lots of water appearing on site and threatening to drown out the vegetation that we've been growing. We have also created 2 prototype adjustable weirs. So you can see one of them in the picture in the presentation. So we've created a larger one and a smaller one. The larger one's shown in the picture. They're they cost less than kind of your typical tilting weirs, so it means we can install more across the site. They're really quick to install. We can kind of install them in a couple of hours rather than a couple of days or a week or so for a tilting weir. And the likelihood is that the wider site will probably need hundreds of these weirs over the next few years to adjust the water levels on targeted areas of standing water. So there should be a real benefit for the wider site. We're doing some scrub management again, as Neil mentioned in that slide. Always rhododendron to remove, so we've got more to remove on farm moors. And the areas that are too wet, we're tackling with contour bunding. So we'll bund some areas, and hopefully that will help manage the water levels within our tolerance in those areas too. Thanks, Lewis.
Right, it's my turn. Hi, I'm Harriet from the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust, and as already been mentioned by Lewis, Crowle is part of Thorn, divided by the county boundary and the Swinefleet warping drain that runs directly, severing us from them. Crowle itself is standing at just over 200 hectares, with Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust owning about 188 hectares of that. Across the site, it's quite variable, but we have some favourable species on site, such as sundews that's been shown in the picture, bog cranberries, multiple species of sphagnum mosses, key for bog forming, and also cotton grass. But yes, due to the site being historically fragmented in its ownership, the state of the site isn't consistent all the way across, and Crowle has had multiple owners historically, less so now as shown on the map. The lighter yellow is, plus a few extra bits that we've since purchased since this last map was made, is Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust, with the evidence of the historic strip farming still showing with the strip ownership. The evidence of the strip ownership can also be shown from the aerial pictures on your bottom left, showing the cuttings and the drains still running off-site towards the farmlands. And this is still showing one of our major problems on site of water being funneled off. On the Crowle was taken under Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust in the 1990s, and obviously peat cutting finished there, and as Lewis mentioned, it was only ever hand cut. But some of the other areas continued to be cut, I think, till the early 2000s. So as you can see on the top right and the middle picture at the bottom, we have some areas that were abstracted for a lot longer, so they lie a lot lower. Basically on site, with this multiple ownership historically, our biggest issues of management of site has been undoing the drainage to try and hold as much water back on site, a lot more water back on site, because these drains have led to some areas, particularly the higher areas, having that encroachment of unfavourable species, predominantly silver birch and bracken, tend to increase that water loss, as Neil mentioned, through evapotranspiration, which directly competes with the favourable species, but also dries out the peat. However, as seen on this next picture, there are large pockets that are in favourable condition, and we'd like to see more of it like this. This area in particular tends to hold the water for optimal range that Paul mentioned for longer, even to the point where it stays pretty much at the surface most of the year round, even into the summer. Only when we get quite drought weather does it tend to drop, but even then not too far that the sphagnum dies off. So as you can see on this picture, it's quite a healthy mixture of sphagnum. There's also, I don't know if you can see, but lots of sundews dotted in that picture. We haven't fully mapped out where they are, but we do have large pockets of sundews. There are some silver birch showing in that picture, but they don't tend to grow over 1 to 2 metres in these areas where the water's levels are good, and that's because obviously they get stunted by the high water levels. The hope is eventually that they're just too waterlogged and they will die off, and then in some areas on site we've got that dead standing woodland, which we just leave there as an interesting habitat for birds and predatory birds to use. But as part of the site restoration, we obviously had to do some baselining. So this baselining, obviously, we had to know how much peat we have there for us to know how much work we needed to do and where we needed to concentrate on fixing. And the initial baselining that we did is for peat depth, and we did this in 2022 with peat rods, which is usually an upland method of determining peat depth. But because we did this together with Thorn, there were over 1,000 points in an 100-metre grid to be sampled. So if we'd done this with cores or augers, it would have taken a long time and a lot of money and a lot of effort. So the choice was made to use peat rods here. And as you can see on Kroll, in some places we nearly have 5 metres recorded, with most of the site ranging from 1 to 3 metres depth. We do have Lincoln Uni students come on most years. They come to take cores of the peat to do paleoecological surveys and for their studies. Sorry, it's a long word for me. And they come every year, and they've been focusing on the deeper areas. And so far their cores have corresponded with the peat rods, which is always good. And year on year, they actually have a bit of competition going between themselves as to who's getting the deepest core. They're coming back on in February this next year, and I'm hoping to put them on the deepest, the right deepest areas and see if they can get close to that 5 metres recorded. As well as engaging with students and members of the public, obviously previously mentioned, it's really important for us to engage with the surrounding farmlands, because as you can see, though there's straight lines where the moor ends and the farmland begins, we all know that that isn't a fixed boundary. Nature is functioning into the farmland, and farmland activities are affecting the moors. So it's really important for us to work with the farmers, especially with some of them owning pieces of the moor themselves still. So as part of that kind of initial engagement with the LIFE project and with the Nature for Climate Fund, we engaged on the peat soils on their land. So with the help of giving us confidence, basically, the FEP team, which is the Fenzies Peat Partnership down south of Lincolnshire, with training with them, we're able to go on and show farmers how to assess their peat soils on their lands and ask them whether they wanted to be included in some peat sampling. A lot of them expected to find peat from the surface, which we obviously, of successive years of ploughing and working the land, that's not the case. But as you can see in the middle picture, we did find some buried, quite significant, up to 3 metres in one place underneath a metre or so of degraded land. And they're just a comparative picture of a core from the moor and the core off the moor. The difference is quite palpable. Not just peat needs sampling, however, other baselining had to be carried out. So we need to know the water levels and vegetation, and LiDAR we had done on site. This was done in conjunction with like I said, the Nature for Climate project. Overall, oversight, we installed 13 dip wells, of which most of them were on sites where a water level management plan carried out by a consultant about 15 years ago. They originally put in about 8 dip wells. We tried to go with the same location, and we were actually able to find some of them, but a lot of them were lost through damage through deer and time, obviously, the plastic shattering and probably snapping, and we weren't able to find all of them. But we reinstated them in the area that with the reference that we had. We also additionally installed 5 more to get a better coverage of the site and to cover a couple of small pieces of land that we were able to purchase recently, and to give us a more extensive coverage. Volunteers were key in installing and finding original dip wells, installing them, and we've been training them up to do the monitoring themselves. We also installed 6 surface level change rods, which is in that middle picture at the bottom, sort of overlapping one of the others. It's just a cheap and easy way of monitoring the peat loss on site. Both the dip wells and the surface level change rod are unfortunately showing that the water levels on site and are not favourable from the majority of the site, and across the site, excuse me, we're showing 1 to 2 centimetres of peat loss. However, these surface level change rods have only been in place a year, so it'd be interesting to see post-winter, when we've had a bit more waterfall, see if it reduces the amount we've actually lost this year. Previously, a lot of management has been done by the reserves team in trying to reduce water loss off-site, such as blocking up the drains, like I mentioned before, and scrub removal. But in some areas, this has been more difficult than others, and we have quite a significant population of rhododendron that's already been mentioned previously. And this year, through the LIFE project, we've got some contractors going onto site to target these. This is it's quite hard to see, but it's quite a monster of a rhododendron. We've got a couple of other places like this, and then they form as sources and they cluster around. You've got quite a wide area of rhododendron spread. Usually we would use the warden himself or our volunteers to try and tackle these, but the warden has got a lot of other things on his hands, and the volunteers, some of the areas that the rhododendron is spreading are quite wet and quite remote and uneven, so it could be quite dangerous for us to send some of our volunteers out there. So the decision was made to use some of the LIFE funding to get on top of these and see how we do and map them for the next couple of years and see if we need to hit them again before the end of the project. Additionally, from that water level management plan that I previously mentioned, other solutions to reduce water loss were suggested. If we owned the land, some of the land that's adjacent to the strip shown in the picture on the left, in the middle, there is a 2 metre drop to the left of this picture, and on that, that's pulling quite a significant amount of water off site. So one of the suggestions for the water level management plan was to reprofile this strip to a slope rather than a severe cliff. Unfortunately, we don't own that bit, so we can't carry out this work without permission from that landowner, which we don't have. So the second option that they suggested was plastic piling. Now, the original project for LIFE, the original amount that was supposed to be installed was 1.1 kilometres of plastic piling, but before the project could be initiated, the price of plastic basically doubled. So in February 2022, we were only initially able to install approximately 600 metres of plastic piling along this strip. As you can see, it's quite clear in this picture. This had previously been cut as a fire break because there's trees next to it, as you can see, so this is a fire break. So the only obstacles for the contractor on this bit were bog oaks buried underneath and getting onto site because it's 1.1 kilometres in. The decision was made to go down to 2.5 metres consistently along this strip, even though the peat does vary up to 3 metres in a couple of places along this line. However, due to not wanting to waste too much plastic and waste contractor time, decision was made to stick with a consistent 2.5, because if we'd gone for, say, 3 metres and he could only push it down 2, you're cutting that 1 metre and wasting plastic and wasting his time every time he's trying to push down. The contractor suggested that the 2.5 seemed to work fine everywhere, and he's confident that it went for the majority of the strip down to the underlying soil underneath. And as can be seen in this picture, it was quite successful last winter at holding back quite a lot of water. Last winter was able to show us how successful it'd been, but also some issues. As you can see, it's topping over at this place. So some places we needed to modify that. But thanks to reprofiling some of our underspend on our project, as you can see on the next picture, we were able to go into the next section of the piling to finish it off, to finish that 1.2 kilometres. This presented, as you can already see, with a different problem. In the way of this last 500 metres was 1 hectare of young silver birch. So our reserve manager has successfully removed that 1 hectare of trees. Most of them fell below the felling licence, but we still obviously got a felling licence to carry out this work. And then thanks to the hard work of our Isle of Axholme Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust volunteers and Yorkshire Wildlife Trust Humberhead level team, we're able to clear this up into a nice neat line. So on the next picture you can see it's all clear and ready for the contractors to go in. The contractors were actually able to go in last week quite successfully and had finished by last Wednesday. Unfortunately, don't have any pictures of that. Yes, watch this space to see how successful, because we have water level monitoring up and down the strip on either side, and see how effective. By next year, I should be able to see how effective this has been at holding water. So yes, that's what we've been up to. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you both. So on to Thorn, where the hydrological works have enabled us to have control over the water levels in areas to plant out some sphagnum. So a propagator produced some hummocks for us with the five species in it: Capillifolium, Fimbriatum, Palustre, Papillosum and Subnitans in our hummocks. And we targeted three areas of bare peat, as these were our biggest sort of CO2 emitters. So we gained hydrological control, and then we were going to plant out sphagnum. Now it's difficult to revegetate the whole bare peat sections with sphagnum alone due to the fragility of the plant, so exposure to sun and wind caused them to dry out and die. So in 2024, with a large team of volunteers from the Natural England, Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust and Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, we planted out 10,000 plugs of sphagnum around the fringes of these bare peat sections, with the plan that in 2025 we would do some companion planting to push further out into the sections of bare peat. So after a conversation with the Care Peat project, they suggested they'd had some success with planting out cotton grass plants initially, letting them establish and then planting the sphagnum in between the cotton grass plants that they'd planted. And this gives some kind of shelter to the sphagnum and helps it establish further out into those bare peat areas. So that's the plan for 2025 with our sphagnum planting. Neil mentioned about Large Heath and the extensive monitoring we've had done by a very enthusiastic team of volunteers. So Large Heath has been monitored on our site since the 1980s along these transect routes. And we've got a really good data set of large heath numbers and abundance. So large heath, for those that don't know, is a peatland species. The caterpillar food plant is hare's tail cottongrass, and the butterfly's preferred food plant is cross-leaved heath, which are all peatland species. They tend to fly in late May to the end of July and need warm, sunny conditions with low wind to actually fly and mate for the subsequent season. And I believe Thorn is the second most southerly location in England with large heath. So as part of the LIFE Moor Space project, we popped in a new transect that runs along a tramway through our project area. And due to it being a peatland species and relying on good peatland habitat, we are going to be running a small-scale study as to whether we can use large heath as a biological indicator to peatland restoration. So we can hopefully be able to survey for large heath numbers, which would indicate whether the restoration work is going in the right direction. So that's our plan with large heath. We started doing the transect this year. And just a little bit about our monitoring approach. So we really wanted to do long-term repeatable monitoring. As part of LIFE projects, they want us to monitor for 30 years after the work has been done. And so we really had to think about what the environment's going to be looking like in 15 to 30 years. So an example being that Large Heath transect going through on a tramway is not the ideal environment, although it cuts through the ideal environment. It's not the ideal environment for Large Heath. But in 30 years, when the site's a lot wetter, we'll still be able to access and run those Large Heath surveys, whereas some of the older transects that have been monitored since the 80s are becoming inaccessible, which is a good thing because the site is getting wetter, but we can't continue the data sets. Another piece that we've done is we've decided to use drones over satellites for our aerial monitoring. And this is great because you can repeat the drone surveys on your schedule. The quality is fantastic and you can easily see changes over the seasons. So we're looking at 3 data sets, 2 summer ones from 2024 and 2023 and a winter 2023-24 data set. And the quality is fantastic. So this is one of our bare peat sections where you can actually make out some of the sphagnum plugs planted around the fringes, these little white dots around the edges of the sphagnum, the bare peat pan. And then lastly, as Harriet mentioned, we've added dip wells and surface level change rods in areas where our capital works have been undertaken. So finally, a little bit on knowledge sharing. Again, Neil mentioned in his talk about the That's Life project how important this is for sharing information with other projects. So we've obviously got a series of webinars, and our next one, although we don't have a date nailed down for this, it's likely to be in January, February. We'll be looking at AI in peatland restoration, so that should be really exciting, and I'll let you guys all know the date for that when it comes out. We've run a series of workshops with more to come in 2025, but so far we've looked at hydrology, Large Heath and sphagnum ID. Funding, we're providing some funding for replication of some of the work that we've done as part of the LIFE Moor Space project. We're able to fund 5 small-scale projects, so if anyone has a project idea, please feel free to get in touch. And then reporting, we're producing information notes and best practice guides, and then site visits and conferences just for general knowledge sharing and networking. All helps to share and improve peatland restoration across the board. Okay, so we've only got a couple of minutes left for any questions that anyone's popped in the chat. I don't think we've had any questions come through. So if anyone does have any questions, pop them in now. If not, you can always email me. My email is down at the bottom of the slide there. But if there are no questions, then we can leave it there. I'll just say thank you very much for your time for attending, and hopefully see you at the next one.